Hey there everybody, I'm Burak and welcome to Cathlist. A popular statement people make when dismissing the Catholic Church is, well, what about what your people did in the Crusades? That's a fair question, but the Crusades are one of the most misunderstood events in Western and church history, and they are often used in context with other violent conquests. So, what were the Crusades? Where did we get the idea of the Crusades? Were they really a tool of Christian predators used to try to conquer the world? Were they an early forerunner of Western imperialism and global conquest? What is the truth about the Crusades? Are there any other questions I should be asking in this episode? Scholars are still working some of that out, and debate is healthy, but there is a lot of consensus. It's a broad and complicated topic, but we'll do our best to present a Crusades 101 here. Stick around, because there are a few things Catholics and non-Catholics alike are probably getting wrong about the Crusades. Let's start off with this. When were the Crusades? The time of the Crusades was a significant period of around 700 years. That's a long time. The movement began when Pope Blessed Urban II preached the First Crusade on November 28, 1095 at the Council of Clermont, a mixed synod of both clergy, priests, deacons, bishops, and laypeople. They ended in 1798. During that period, there were crusades against the Muslims in the Holy Land, Spain, the Balkans, and Austria. There were crusades against the pagan tribes in the Baltic regions, against heretics in southern France, and against enemies of the Pope, like the Holy Roman Emperor Friedrich II, or Frederick II. So, what is a crusade? For it to be official, a crusade had to be called and/or preached by the Pope. Participants took a public sacred vow to join a military expedition with an explicit goal. As a sign of their vow, they sewed a red cross onto their garments, which could only be removed upon successful completion of their armed pilgrimage. Okay, now to the historical events. Many people believe that the Crusades were wars of unprovoked oppression, but that is not exactly the case. Within 100 years of the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Muslim armies had conquered former Christian-controlled lands in the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain. Jerusalem was taken in 638, and Muslim armies launched raids into the Mediterranean and attacked Rome in 846. Christians and Jews were relegated to second-class citizen status. They could practice their religions, but were heavily regulated and moderated. Now, don't get me wrong, there were periods of relative peace and calm between Muslims and Christians in there, but that changed in 1009 when the Egyptian Muslim ruler of Jerusalem ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which housed Jesus' empty tomb. The church was later rebuilt, but in 1065, the Seljuk Turks, non-Arab Muslims, began a violent campaign of persecution against Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, in which the Bishop of Bamberg, Germany, Bamberg, what a cool place, and 12,000 pilgrims were massacred by Muslims only 2 miles from Jerusalem. Following another lost battle in 1071, the Byzantine emperor wrote to Pope Blessed Urban II, pleading for aid. Thus began the Crusades. The first Crusaders were armed pilgrimages who marched to restore Christian lands. The view of the church was this was a defensive war aimed at the restoration of Christian property and protection for Christians visiting the Holy Land, not unprovoked aggressive campaign of conquest. Don't get me wrong. They committed atrocities against Muslims and Jews in Jerusalem when they captured the city, and that is inexcusable. We are attempting to document the purpose of the Crusades, even if the Crusaders did not live up to that purpose. Now, let's address the issue of the slaughter of Jerusalem's inhabitants a little further. Shortly after the 9/11 attacks, former President Bill Clinton said in a speech that one reason why Muslims so strongly dislike the Western world was because of the massacre of the inhabitants of Jerusalem in 1099. The practice of massacring the inhabitants of a conquered city under siege was unfortunately a common practice at the time. Therefore, many cities agreed to terms before the commencement of the siege. If a city surrendered before the siege, typically the inhabitants could remain in the city and keep their possessions. Armies throughout history and of a variety of religions followed this policy. None of this justifies the Christians' actions after sacking the city. In fact, one might argue they should have been the ones to break this practice. I mean, they were Christian, for goodness sakes. Unfortunately, they did not. But to suggest that this was unique to the Crusades is definitely a misrepresentation. Another misconception about the Crusades is that they are about European greed. Some did hope to use the Crusades as an opportunity to try to enrich themselves. However, in the last 40 years, historians have discovered that many of the crusading knights were already wealthy men who gave up everything to undertake this holy mission. Even the wealthiest people could easily impoverish themselves and their families by joining a crusade, not to mention leaving their family for years on end. Some crusaders intended to use the hardships of the crusade as a penitential act of charity and love for their fellow Christians, and probably for the state of their soul. One such crusader, Odo of Burgundy, wrote, "The journey to Jerusalem is a penance for my sins, since divine mercy inspired me that owing to the enormity of my sins, I should go to the sepulchre of our Savior, in order that this offering of my devotion might be more acceptable in the sight of God. I decided, not unreasonably, that I should make the journey with the peace of all men and most greatly of the servants of God." Again, not all crusaders had noble motives. They were a curious mix of rich, poor, saints, and sinners, but to write off all crusaders as power-hungry gold hunters is unfair. Some consider the Crusades to be the first targeted wars against the Jews. Like so many things in this list, it's complicated.
Life's like this.
As the first Crusaders marched through Europe on their way to the Holy Land via Constantinople, many smaller bands of armed men followed in their wake. Count Emico was a nobleman from what is now Western Germany who led one of these bands and took it upon himself to target various Jewish communities in the Rhine Valley. Emico, sometimes called Emich, decided that it was pointless for the Crusaders to march 2,500 miles to fight Islam when there were what he called enemies of Christ in their midst, the Jews. The church in no way endorsed Count Emico's misguided and unsanctioned ideas of restoring holiness. Many clergy tried to protect the local Jews. One bishop actively arrested and punished those involved in Emico's private crusade. Another bishop allowed local Jews to take up refuge in his palace. When Emico found out, he stormed the place and slaughtered everyone, Christians and Jews. It's important to note that many contemporaries of Emico condemned his actions at the time, and the church actively spoke out against such outrages, including Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who personally went to Germany to rebuke a monk who preached and exhorted people to engage in such activities. So, these groups who did these terrible things to God's chosen people cannot be called crusaders. They were opportunists who used the Crusades as the vehicle perpetuating hateful, horrible actions against the Jews. Sadly, many Jewish communities were harmed during the 700 years of the crusading movement. And we can't dismiss that. It was terrible. It was wrong. And with that, we'll see you next week. I'm Pete Burak, and you've been watching Cathlist. God bless. The church was later rebuilt, but in 1065, the Seljuk church... Who wrote this script? Scott? Well done, sir. Well done. Again, not all crusaders had mobile... not devices.